John Anderson had always dreamed of living a peaceful life surrounded by nature, and he finally achieved it when he bought his ranch. Nestled in the heart of the countryside, the property stretched as far as the eye could see, with rolling hills, tall trees, and open fields bathed in golden sunlight during the day. It wasn't just land, it was freedom. For John, this place represented everything he loved: wide open spaces, quiet mornings, and the ability to live life on his own terms. John wasn't just any ordinary ranch owner. He was passionate about firearms. He grew up learning how to handle guns responsibly from his father, who taught him that owning a firearm came with great responsibility. Over time, John became an expert marksman and took pride in teaching others about gun safety. On weekends, you'd often find him at the back of his property, where he set up targets for practice. Sometimes, friends would come over, bringing their kids along so John could teach them the basics: how to hold a gun properly, aim carefully, and respect its power. These sessions weren't just about shooting. They were lessons in discipline, focus, and accountability. The neighborhood itself was perfect for someone like John. It was a close-knit community of families and individuals who shared similar values. People who appreciated privacy, but also enjoyed coming together for barbecues or holiday celebrations. The homes here were spread out enough to give everyone space, while still fostering a sense of belonging. There was even a homeowners association, HOA, that managed things like road repairs, streetlights, and the small park near the entrance of the development. But the HOA wasn't intrusive. Most residents barely noticed its existence because it mostly handled mundane tasks without interfering in people's daily lives. Life on the ranch suited John perfectly. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching deer graze in the distance. Evenings ended with stargazing under clear skies, far away from city lights. His dogs roamed freely across the property, barking occasionally at rabbits darting through the brush. It was simple, fulfilling, and exactly what John wanted. But there was more to John than just being a rancher and a gun enthusiast. He believed deeply in the principles of freedom and self-reliance. Owning firearms wasn't just a hobby for him. It was part of his identity. He saw it as a way to protect himself, his family, and his property if ever the need arose. And though he rarely talked about politics, he knew the importance of standing up for one's rights. That mindset would soon be put to the test in ways he never imagined. For now, however, life felt nearly perfect. Neighbors waved as they drove past his mailbox. Kids played soccer in the cul-de-sac, and the hum of tractors working nearby blended seamlessly with the rustling leaves. John couldn't have asked for a better existence. Little did he know, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, ready to disrupt the tranquility he cherished so much. Change came to the neighborhood when Sarah Collins was elected as the new president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. At first, no one thought much of it. Elections for the HOA board happened every year, and usually, it didn't make much difference who took charge. Most people assumed Sarah would follow in the footsteps of her predecessors, quietly managing budgets, organizing seasonal cleanups, and ensuring streetlights worked properly. But Sarah had different plans. Sarah wasn't like the previous leaders. She was outspoken, ambitious, and determined to leave her mark on the community. From the moment she stepped into her role, she began pushing for changes that caught many residents off guard. Some of her ideas seemed harmless enough at first, like painting the park benches or adding flower beds near the entrance. But soon, her proposals grew more controversial. She started talking about modernizing the neighborhood and making it safer, which sounded good in theory, but left some neighbors uneasy. One topic dominated Sarah's agenda: guns. Unlike most people in the area, Sarah didn't believe firearms belonged in a residential community. To her, they represented danger, something that could harm families, lower property values, and tarnish the neighborhood's reputation. She argued passionately at HOA meetings that guns were outdated and unnecessary in today's world. Her speeches often included dramatic stories she'd heard on the news about accidents involving firearms, even though none of those incidents had ever happened in their community. At first, Sarah tried to win over residents by suggesting compromises, like limiting where guns could be stored or requiring special permits for ownership. But when those suggestions failed to gain traction, she decided to take drastic action. Without warning, she called an emergency meeting of the HOA board and pushed through a sweeping rule banning all firearms within the boundaries of the development. The ban covered everything: owning, carrying, storing, or using firearms, even on private property like John Anderson's ranch. News of the ban spread quickly, leaving residents stunned. Many hadn't even known about the emergency meeting because Sarah hadn't given much notice. When neighbors asked why such a major decision was made without consulting them, Sarah brushed off their concerns, insisting it was necessary for everyone's safety. She claimed the board had the authority to act swiftly in cases where public welfare was at stake. But deep down, some suspected her motives weren't entirely altruistic. Rumors circulated that Sarah harbored a personal dislike for gun owners, fueled by past disagreements with neighbors who didn't share her views. For John, the ban felt like a direct attack on his way of life. He couldn't imagine giving up something so central to his identity, or risking fines and penalties just to keep doing what he'd always done legally. Other residents grumbled among themselves, calling the ban unfair and heavy-handed. Yet, despite their frustration, few dared to challenge Sarah directly. Known for her sharp tongue and intimidating demeanor, she had a way of silencing dissenters before they could even speak up. As days turned into weeks, tension simmered beneath the surface of the once peaceful neighborhood. What had been a quiet corner of the countryside now buzzed with whispered conversations about rights, freedom, and whether anyone could stop Sarah from imposing her will. For John, this was only the beginning of a battle he never expected to fight, but one he knew he couldn't ignore. John Anderson wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let someone take away his rights without a fight. The new gun ban didn't just feel wrong, it felt personal. For years, he had followed every rule, paid his dues on time, and been a responsible member of the community. He had always respected the HOA's role in maintaining shared spaces and keeping things running smoothly. But this was different. Sarah Collins and her board weren't just overstepping. They were trampling on something far bigger than neighborhood guidelines. They were challenging John's freedom. At first, John tried to reason with Sarah. He attended the next HOA meeting, hoping to have a calm conversation about why the ban was unnecessary and unfair. He explained how he'd owned firearms for decades without incident, using them responsibly for sport, self-defense, and teaching others. He pointed out that no one in the neighborhood had ever been harmed by a gun or even complained about guns before the ban. But Sarah wasn't interested in listening. She dismissed his arguments with vague statements about progress and community standards, refusing to engage in any meaningful discussion. Frustrated but not defeated, John decided to dig deeper. He began researching state laws and constitutional protections related to gun ownership. What he discovered gave him hope and ammunition. It turned out that the HOA's authority was limited by both federal and state laws. While associations could enforce certain rules, they couldn't override constitutional rights like the Second Amendment. Moreover, many states explicitly protected individuals from overly restrictive firearm bans, even within private communities. Armed with this knowledge, John realized he had a strong case against the HOA. But taking legal action wasn't an easy decision. Lawsuits were expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. John knew it would mean months, or possibly years, of fighting in court, all while dealing with mounting legal fees. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't just about him anymore. If he backed down, what message would that send? Would other residents lose faith in standing up for themselves? Worse yet, would Sarah and her allies feel emboldened to impose even more restrictions in the future? Determined to see this through, John reached out to a lawyer who specialized in property rights and constitutional law. During their initial consultation, the attorney listened intently as John laid out his concerns. By the end of the meeting, The lawyer agreed that the ban was legally questionable at best and outright unlawful at worst. Together, they drafted a formal complaint accusing the HOA of violating John's rights and exceeding its authority. The lawsuit also sought to overturn the ban entirely, ensuring it wouldn't affect anyone else in the community. As word spread about John's legal challenge, reactions among neighbors varied. Some quietly cheered him on, grateful that someone was finally standing up to Sarah's authoritarian leadership. Others expressed sympathy but hesitated to get involved, fearing backlash or retaliation from the HOA board. A few openly criticized John, saying his lawsuit might cause division or make the neighborhood look bad. Despite the mixed response, John remained resolute. He understood that change often came with resistance, but he believed in doing what was right, not what was easy. In the weeks leading up to filing the lawsuit, John spent countless hours preparing. He gathered documents proving his compliance with safety regulations, collected testimonials from neighbors who supported his stance, and reviewed every detail of the HOA's governing documents. Each step reinforced his conviction that this battle was worth fighting. Though the road ahead promised challenges, John felt ready. He wasn't just defending his own rights. He was fighting for everyone's freedom to live as they chose, without fear of losing what mattered most. The lawsuit quickly became the talk of the neighborhood, stirring emotions and dividing opinions. For John Anderson, it marked the beginning of a grueling yet pivotal chapter in his life. Legal battles are rarely simple, and this one proved no exception. As depositions began and documents were exchanged, the complexities of the case unfolded, revealing layers of tension that had long simmered beneath the surface of the seemingly peaceful community. One of the first major revelations came during Sarah Collins' deposition. Under questioning from John's attorney, she admitted to holding strong personal biases against firearms. When asked why she had pushed so aggressively for the ban, Sarah hesitated before finally stating, "I believe guns have no place in modern society." Her words sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and later the entire neighborhood. It wasn't just about safety or property values anymore. It was clear that Sarah's actions stemmed from her own beliefs, which she had imposed on everyone else without their consent. This admission painted her not as a neutral leader trying to protect the community, but as someone using her position to force her views onto others. As the legal process continued, more cracks began to appear in the HOA's defense. Emails obtained during discovery revealed heated exchanges between Sarah and other board members. In one particularly damning message, Sarah threatened to remove anyone who opposed her from the board if they didn't fall in line with her agenda. Another email showed her instructing staff to rush the ban into effect without proper notice to residents, a blatant violation of the HOA's own procedures. These documents painted a picture of an organization run less like a democratic body and more like a dictatorship, with Sarah at the helm. Meanwhile, John's team worked tirelessly to build a solid case. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the importance of gun ownership rights under both federal and state laws. One witness, a constitutional law professor, explained how restrictive covenants, like those enforced by HOAs, couldn't override fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Another witness, a local sheriff, highlighted the role responsible gun owners played in maintaining safety in rural areas like theirs. His testimony countered Sarah's claims that firearms inherently made communities less secure. Public opinion started shifting as details of the case emerged. Neighbors who had initially stayed silent began speaking out, sharing stories of how the ban affected them personally. A retired veteran named Tom recounted how he used his rifle to scare off coyotes threatening his livestock. A young mother described teaching her teenage son firearm safety as part of his preparation for adulthood. Each story added weight to John's argument that the ban wasn't just impractical, it was harmful. Despite these victories, the fight took its toll on John. The financial burden of mounting legal fees weighed heavily on him, forcing him to dip into savings he'd set aside for future projects on the ranch. Late nights poring over documents left him exhausted, and the stress sometimes made it hard to focus on daily tasks. Yet, whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself why he was doing this. Not just for himself, but for every neighbor who deserved the right to live freely. By the time the trial officially began, anticipation hung thick in the air. Local news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of broader debates about individual rights versus collective rules. People outside the community watched closely, wondering whether justice would prevail. For John, the stakes had never felt higher. Every day in court was a test of endurance, patience, and faith in the system. But deep down, he believed the truth would shine through, and when it did, it would change everything. The turning point in the case came unexpectedly, like a crack of thunder on a clear day. It wasn't just one moment, but a series of revelations that slowly unraveled the HOA's defense and exposed the flaws in Sarah Collins' leadership. As the trial progressed, what had started as a legal battle over gun rights transformed into something much larger, a reckoning for an organization that had overstepped its bounds. During cross-examination, Sarah struggled to defend her actions under intense questioning from John's attorney. When asked why she hadn't followed proper procedures before implementing the ban, she stumbled over her words, claiming it was an emergency situation. But when pressed for evidence of any actual emergencies involving firearms in the neighborhood, she couldn't provide a single example. The courtroom fell silent as the judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her vague answers. For many observers, this exchange revealed the truth. The ban wasn't about safety. It was about control. Things got worse for the HOA when other board members took the stand. One former member, Rachel, testified that Sarah had bullied and intimidated dissenting voices during meetings. Rachel described heated arguments where Sarah dismissed opposing opinions with dismissive remarks like, "If you don't agree, maybe you shouldn't be here." Another board member admitted he had voted for the ban only because he feared retaliation if he didn't. These testimonies painted a troubling picture of an HOA board that operated more like a clique than a democratic body, silencing anyone who dared to challenge Sarah's authority. The final blow came when internal emails were presented as evidence. Among them was a chain showing Sarah instructing staff to bypass standard notification protocols so residents wouldn't have time to object to the gun ban. This blatant disregard for transparency infuriated both the court and the community. Even some of Sarah's staunchest supporters began to question her methods. A neighbor named Mark, who had initially backed the ban, publicly apologized after seeing the documents. "I thought she was doing what was best for us," he said at a community meeting. "Now I realize we were misled." Outside the courtroom, public sentiment shifted dramatically. What had once been whispered conversations turned into open discussions about accountability and fairness. Residents shared stories of feeling powerless under Sarah's leadership, describing how small grievances, like fines for harmless rule violations, had gone unchecked. The lawsuit became a catalyst for change, empowering people to speak up against years of unchecked authority. Sarah herself seemed to crumble under the weight of the mounting pressure. Once confident and commanding, she now appeared defensive and unsure, avoiding eye contact with neighbors during breaks in the trial. Her resignation letter arrived shortly after the most damning evidence surfaced. In it, she cited personal reasons for stepping down, but avoided addressing the controversy directly. While some felt relief at her departure, others saw it as too little, too late. The damage had already been done, not just to her reputation, but to the trust between the HOA and the community. For John Anderson, these developments brought a mix of vindication and exhaustion. He knew they were closer to victory, but the emotional toll of the fight lingered. Late one evening, sitting on his porch with his dogs curled up at his feet, he reflected on how far things had come. Neighbors who had once hesitated to support him now stopped by to thank him for standing firm. "You're fighting for all of us," one said sincerely. Those words reminded John why he had taken this journey in the first place, to protect not just his own freedom, but the rights of everyone around him. As the trial neared its conclusion, hope replaced uncertainty. The pieces were falling into place, and justice seemed within reach. For the first time in months, John allowed himself to imagine life after the lawsuit, a return to peace, respect, and unity in the neighborhood. But until the final verdict was delivered, he remained focused, knowing the fight wasn't over yet. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Neighbors packed the benches, some clutching notebooks, others nervously fidgeting as they waited for the judge's decision. Reporters lined the back rows, pens poised to capture every word. For John Anderson, the moment felt surreal, a culmination of months of struggle, sacrifice, and determination. He sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady his breathing. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about justice. When the judge entered the room, a hush fell over the crowd. After a brief pause, she began reading her ruling. Her voice was calm but firm as she outlined the key points of the case. She noted that while HOAs have certain powers to regulate communities, those powers are not unlimited. Restrictive covenants cannot override constitutional rights, she declared, emphasizing that the Second Amendment protections applied even within private developments like this one. The gun ban, she explained, was not only unlawful, but also implemented improperly by passing required notifications and procedures. The judge didn't stop there. She went on to criticize the HOA's conduct throughout the process, calling out Sarah Collins' leadership style as authoritarian and dismissive of residents' concerns. An HOA exists to serve its members, not dictate their lives based on personal biases, she stated sternly. The ruling was clear. The firearm ban was null and void, and the HOA was ordered to cease enforcing it immediately. But the surprises didn't end there. In a move that stunned everyone, the judge ruled that the HOA's actions had caused harm to the community, not just legally but emotionally and financially. To address this, she awarded punitive damages to each household affected by the ban. Every resident would receive $50,000 as compensation for the stress, legal uncertainty, and infringement on their rights. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as people processed the magnitude of the decision. For many families, this unexpected windfall represented more than just money. It symbolized validation, the acknowledgement that their voices mattered. Sarah Collins, sitting silently in the front row, looked pale and defeated. Once a figure of authority and confidence, she now seemed small and fragile. As the judge finished speaking, she quickly gathered her things and left the courtroom without saying a word. Rumors spread later that she had already vacated her position on the board and planned to move out of the neighborhood entirely. Whether out of shame or self-preservation, no one knew for sure, but her abrupt exit marked the end of an era. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted as neighbors hugged and congratulated one another. Some cried tears of relief, overwhelmed by the weight finally lifting from their shoulders. John stood at the center of it all, shaking hands and accepting heartfelt thanks from people he hadn't even realized supported him so strongly. "You did this for all of us," said one elderly neighbor, gripping his arm tightly. "We'll never forget what you've done." For John, the victory was bittersweet. Yes, he had won, a triumph not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in standing up against injustice. Yet, the journey had taken its toll. Late nights poring over documents, countless hours in court, and the constant worry about finances had left him drained. Still, seeing the joy and gratitude on his neighbors' faces made it all worthwhile. He thought back to the quiet mornings on his ranch before the chaos began and realized something important. Peace wasn't just about solitude. It was about living freely, without fear of losing your rights. That evening, John returned home to find several neighbors waiting for him, holding signs that read, "Thank you, John," and "Freedom Fighter." They brought food, drinks, and stories of how they planned to use the settlement money, fixing roofs, building playgrounds, funding scholarships for local kids. It was a celebration of resilience, unity, and the power of standing together. For the first time in a long while, John felt truly at ease. The fight was over, and freedom had prevailed. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal after the lawsuit, but it was a new normal, one shaped by lessons learned and bonds strengthened through adversity. The $50,000 settlement checks began arriving in mailboxes, bringing with them not just financial relief, but also a renewed sense of hope. For many residents, the money represented more than compensation. It symbolized justice served and a reminder that standing up for what's right could lead to meaningful change. John Anderson watched as his neighbors used the funds in creative ways. Some invested in home improvements, fixing leaky roofs, painting faded walls, or upgrading outdated kitchens. Others pooled their resources for community projects. A group of families transformed the small park near the entrance into a vibrant gathering space, complete with new swings, picnic tables, and flower gardens. Another initiative created a scholarship fund to help local students pursue higher education. These efforts didn't just beautify the area, they brought people closer together, fostering a spirit of collaboration that had been missing under Sarah Collins' leadership. For John, the victory wasn't about the money, though he did use his share to build a proper shooting range on his property, complete with safety barriers and shaded seating. It was about restoring balance and trust within the community. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now waved warmly as they passed each other on the road. Barbecues and holiday parties drew bigger crowds than ever before, filled with laughter and shared meals. Conversations flowed easily, unburdened by the tension that had lingered during the height of the legal battle. The HOA itself underwent significant changes. With Sarah gone, a new board was elected, one committed to transparency and inclusivity. Meetings became open forums where residents felt comfortable voicing their opinions without fear of retribution. Policies were reviewed and updated to ensure they aligned with both state laws and the values of the community. Slowly but surely, faith in the organization was rebuilt, though it would take time to fully erase the scars left by the past. John emerged from the ordeal as a local hero, admired for his courage and determination. People often stopped him at the grocery store or gas station to thank him again, sharing how his fight had inspired them to stand up for themselves in other areas of life. Kids still came over to practice shooting targets, but now their parents joined them too, eager to learn firearm safety alongside their children. John took pride in knowing he'd made a difference, not just legally, but personally for so many people. Yet, despite the accolades, John remained humble. He knew the fight hadn't been about glory or recognition. It had been about protecting freedom and ensuring no one else would have to endure such an overreach of power. On quiet evenings, he sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and listening to the distant hum of crickets. The ranch was peaceful again, just as it had been before the storm rolled in. But this time, there was an added layer of gratitude for the land, for his neighbors, and for the hard-won victory that reminded everyone of the importance of vigilance. As months turned into years, the story of John's battle against the HOA became part of local lore, a tale told around dinner tables and campfires. It served as a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's determination could spark change. And while John hoped no one would ever have to fight such a battle again, he also knew the community was stronger now, ready to defend its rights and preserve the harmony they all cherished. In the end, life on the ranch returned to what John loved most: simplicity, freedom, and connection. The echoes of gunfire occasionally rang out across the fields once more, blending seamlessly with the rustling leaves and chirping birds. To John, those sounds weren't just noise. They were proof that liberty had triumphed and peace had been restored.